On April 7, 2025, a company called Colossal Biosciences announced something that hadn't happened in 9,500 years. The dire wolf was back, 3 living pups. Proof, they said, of the world's first de-extinction. There was just one problem. The scientist who actually sequenced the ancient dire wolf genome, Colossal's own chief science officer, said they weren't really dire wolves. So what exactly did they make? Colossal isn't a scrappy university lab chasing a dream. By January 2025, the company carried a $10.2 billion valuation and $435 million in total funding. When they announced 3 wolf pups named Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi, the global press ran the story as if prehistory had been reversed. Khaleesi, named after Game of Thrones' Dragon Queen, the show that did more to burn the dire wolf into popular consciousness than any documentary, was born January 30th, 2025. Romulus and Remus arrived earlier, October 1st, 2024. The announcement waited until April 7th to maximize the reveal. The naming wasn't whimsy, it was architecture, a $10.2 billion company building toward a future where de-extinction is commercially viable needs the public to believe the impossible has already happened. Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi are not just wolves. They are a proof of concept for investor confidence. What's at stake and whether we call them dire wolves goes far beyond naming rights. It sets the precedent for every de-extinction claim that follows. To understand why the label matters, start with what a real dire wolf actually was. The scientific name is Inoxion dirus, not Canis lupus, not a larger subspecies of gray wolf, not a close cousin. Inoxion means terrible dog in Greek, a genus name first proposed by paleontologist John Campbell Merriam over a century ago. The scientific community argued about the classification for decades. Then, on January 13, 2021, a landmark paper in Nature settled the question by sequencing 5 ancient dire wolf genomes. The verdict was decisive. Dire wolves diverged from the ancestors of gray wolves and coyotes approximately 5.7 million years ago. 5.7 million years. To feel the weight of that number, consider that Homo habilis, one of the earliest members of our own genus, was just beginning to walk upright in Africa when that split occurred. Dire wolves were not proto-wolves or ancestral wolves, or wolves that happened to be bigger. They were a completely separate New World canid lineage that evolved in the Americas in total genetic isolation. In all the tens of thousands of years they shared North American territory with gray wolves, they never interbred, not once. The 5.7 million year gulf between them made hybridization impossible. We know them in unusual detail because of where they died. The Rancho La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles trapped animals for tens of thousands of years, and dire wolves fell in more often than any other large carnivore. More than 4,000 individual specimens have been recovered, over 400 skulls alone. We can measure exactly how they were built: 60 to 100 kilograms of muscle wrapped around bones heavier and thicker than a gray wolf's, a wide skull anchoring a jaw adapted not to slash and release like Smilodon's sabers, but to clamp and crush. They were bone crackers, built for a world stocked with mammoths, ground sloths, ancient horses, and giant bison. Here's what makes this harder. Their ecological niche had no parallel in the modern world, and their prey is gone. They lived from roughly 125,000 years ago until about 9,500 years ago, when the megafauna they evolved to hunt collapsed and took them with it. Smilodon vanished at the same time, so did the mammoths. The Ice Age ended and an entire predator guild went with it. This is the creature Colossal said they brought back. Here is what they actually did. They obtained ancient DNA from 2 dire wolf specimens, a 13,000-year-old tooth pulled from Sheridan Pit in Ohio, and a 72,000-year-old ear bone from American Falls, Idaho. From those samples, they identified genetic differences between dire wolves and living gray wolves, regions of the genome where the sequences diverged. Then, they took a living gray wolf genome and made 20 targeted edits across 14 genes. The traits they changed were visible ones: larger body size, wider and heavier skull, increased muscle mass, pale coat color that reads as white in photographs. 20 edits, 14 genes. Out of a genomic divergence, scientists estimate at hundreds of thousands of differences accumulated over 5.7 million years. Here is the detail that cuts through every careful framing the announcement offered. The scientist who extracted DNA from that 13,000-year-old tooth and that 72,000-year-old ear bone. The researcher who made Colossal's entire project scientifically possible is Beth Shapiro, UC Santa Cruz paleogenomicist and Colossal's own chief science officer. And Beth Shapiro's assessment of what the pups are: gray wolves with 20 edits. Shapiro has a framework for this. She calls it trait resurrection, and she's been consistent in defending it. Species classifications, she argues, are human constructs, conventions imposed on a continuous biological reality. The project's goal was never to clone a dire wolf cell by cell. It was to identify which genes produce the observable physical differences between the extinct species and its living relative, edit those in, and produce a functional approximation. Her version of the claim: we aren't making clones of extinct animals, we're resurrecting extinct traits. That framing has serious defenders. Species boundaries are genuinely contested in biology. Taxonomists fight over where to draw lines constantly. Gray wolves and domestic dogs share genetic heritage that traces to a single ancestral population, yet we treat them as categorically different. If an animal looks like a dire wolf, moves like one, fills the ecological role of one, at what point does the genomic ledger override the functional reality? The critics answer that question with a number. Jeremy Austin, director of the Australian Centre for Ancient DNA, stated flatly that the animals are not a dire wolf under any definition of a species ever. Jacqueline Gill, paleoecologist at the University of Maine, put it plainly: Colossal Biosciences did not revive dire wolves. Vincent Lynch, evolutionary biologist at the University at Buffalo, called the dire wolf description misleading, but the most clarifying estimate came from a geneticist at the Francis Crick Institute, who calculated that the pups are, optimistically, 1/100,000th of a dire wolf. Not half, not a tenth, 100,000th. The 20 edited traits are morphological. They change how the animal looks. They don't touch the estimated hundreds of thousands of other genomic differences: neurology, immune function, metabolism, thermoregulation, disease resistance, the behavioral wiring that developed across millions of years of separate evolution. A wolf with a broader skull and a pale coat could not step into a Pleistocene ecosystem and perform as a dire wolf. The bones are in the shape. The rest of the animal is still a gray wolf. There's a structural irony buried in this. The very paper that made Colossal's project possible, the 2021 Nature study that sequenced ancient dire wolf genomes and provided the genetic roadmap for those 20 edits, is the same paper that proved dire wolves and gray wolves are too genetically distant to bridge with 20 edits. The scientific foundation and the scientific refutation were built from the same source. MIT Technology Review ran their response piece under the headline, Game of Clones. So, is the dire wolf back? The honest answer is no. The animals at Colossal's undisclosed facility are gray wolves with 20 gene edits targeting morphological traits. That is not nothing. 3 healthy large carnivores with demonstrably altered physical characteristics represent a real advance in targeted gene editing. As proof of concept work for applying CRISPR techniques to large mammals, the project has genuine value, but that value sits in conservation genetics, not de-extinction. What does this precedent unlock or foreclose for everything that comes next? Colossal has 3 other targets operating under the same trait resurrection logic. The woolly mammoth project targets 2028 for hybrid calves, cold adaptation genes edited into Asian elephants, a species that diverged from mammoths roughly 6 million years ago. As of March 2025, they'd already produced gene-edited woolly mice, with mammoth-inspired cold adaptation mutations as proof of concept. The thylacine project has sequenced the complete genome and created stem cells. The last confirmed individual died in 1936 at Hobart Zoo, and with a more recent extinction and far better DNA preservation, the genomic gap is smaller. The dodo genome has been sequenced, Bill morphology genes identified. If we accept the dire wolf precedent, a gene-edited Asian elephant becomes a woolly mammoth. The naming conventions cascade. What would genuine dire wolf de-extinction require? The 2021 study used only 5 ancient genomes. The La Brea tar pits hold more than 4,000 individuals. As sequencing costs drop, a much more complete genomic picture becomes possible. Closing the gap would mean not 20 edits, but potentially hundreds of thousands, targeting not just appearance, but physiology, neurology, immune architecture. That is a project measured in decades, not years. And then there is the ecological problem no gene edit can solve. The dire wolf's world is gone. The mammoths it hunted went extinct 9,500 years ago. The giant ground sloths, the ancient horses, the Pleistocene megafauna that shaped every adaptation in that heavy skull and those bone-crushing jaws, all gone. A genuine dire wolf released into the modern Americas would enter an ecosystem reorganized for 10,000 years. What it hunted no longer exists. The environment that built Enoki and dirus is as extinct as the animal itself. The techniques being developed now, funded in part by the excitement of this announcement, may eventually matter. Sequencing costs are falling. Editing precision is improving. The work on large carnivore gene editing has real applications for conservation, introducing disease resistance into endangered populations, helping species adapt to climate change, preserving genetic diversity. That's meaningful science. But it isn't what the press release said. Colossal says this is de-extinction. Their own chief scientist says the animals are gray wolves with 20 edits. The Francis Crick Institute says they're optimistically 100,000th of a dire wolf. So drop a comment. Is this a scientific breakthrough with a branding problem, or a branding win with a scientific footnote? Next week, we look at the other animal Colossal is trying to bring back, and their evidence for that one is actually harder to argue with.